everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by Projections, North America's leading provider of employee communication resources, including video, websites, e-learning, social media, and virtual events to help you connect with your team. For more information, you can visit us online at projectionsinc.com. I am Jennifer Oraqua, COO of Projections, and your host for today's episode of Project HR. Conflict in the workplace is a given. At some point as a leader, you'll face tension within your ranks. And beyond the immediate and obvious negative effects that these tensions can have on your team, if these conflicts go unmanaged, the costs, that is, the actual dollars and cents of conflict, can be quite high for a company. Some estimate that American companies lose a staggering $359 billion a year due to conflicts resulting in diminished work performance and low employee morale. Joining us today to better understand and manage workplace conflict is David Liddle. David is a thought leader in the areas of organizational dynamics, conflict resolution, and transformational culture. He is CEO of the TCM Group and author of the book Managing Conflict, A Practical Guide to Resolution in the Workplace. David, welcome to Project HR.
Oh, Jennifer, you're very welcome. Thanks very much for inviting me.
So to begin with, I'm curious, how did helping people and organizations manage conflict become such an interest for you?
That's a great question. So Jennifer, I began my life back in the 90s as a mediator. I did a degree in community and race relations. I was very interested in areas of exclusion, discrimination, and of course, promoting inclusion. And I went to work in two inner city estates in Leicester, up here in England. And I saw firsthand how bad we are at handling conflict within our communities, within our society. The often corrosive and adversarial approaches that we saw between neighbours, within communities, within families, and the response of many of the organisations who I believed were there to help resolve conflicts and disputes. Unfortunately, they didn't react effectively, and more often than not, inflamed situations. And having seen, I can only describe it, Jennifer, as an insidious and divisive and damaging impact of conflict on families, I set up one of the first mediation and non-violence and dispute resolution programs here in the UK, helping bring community members together, families together, and entire neighbourhoods together to resolve issues through restorative justice, which I'm a massive fan of, and of course through mediation, facilitating dialogue. And that's where I first began my work. And I was bitten by the mediation bug and have been a passionate advocate of all things dialogue, compassion, mediation, and restorative since that time.
Nice. What a fantastic calling. So the word conflict covers a wide range of behaviors, from minor personality clashes to larger scale issues like harassment. So when we talk about the negative impact that conflict can have on a company's bottom line, are we talking about all of these behaviors?
We are, Jennifer. We need to understand, and this is where I often work with organisations, to understand where those behaviours are coming from. Those behaviours are the symptoms of our actions, our interactions, and our reactions, the air that we breathe out, that people see as our behaviours. And where are they coming from? They're often coming from feelings, emotions, needs, and goals that haven't been expressed or aren't being met. People become very frustrated, very hurt, very isolated, and then those drive those behaviours. So when I'm working with organisations to look at the broad spectrum of conflicts, and you've identified so many in your question, actually what we're starting to do is understand what's the root cause of those behaviours, where are they coming from, and why are they happening. And what I find absolutely fascinating as a mediator, and it's really one of the driving forces for me as a mediator, we have these two or more parties. They appear diametrically opposed. They're in a conflict, a worsening and escalating conflict. But as we start to understand why the behaviours are happening, how do they feel? A critical question, one of those F words, the feelings. And what do they need? What those parties tell us is they need to be heard, to feel respected, to be treated with dignity, to feel valued and included in their workplaces. And actually what happens is Party A, who perceived Party B to be the devil incarnate, and Party B, who thought a Party A was a complete waste of space, start telling me they need the same thing. And this is the incredible power of the dialogue and of mediation, because what we start to see is commonality or convergence, common ground, common purpose. And that's the power of mediation, bringing people together at times of real challenge, and often in disputes and conflicts that appear completely irreconcilable.
So I sort of opined in the introduction that I feel like some conflict is inevitable. Do you believe that?
Absolutely. I often think of myself as a PR agent for conflict. I think of myself for going out and flying the flag for this. It's not conflict that's the problem. It's not conflict that's the problem. It's how we manage conflict that becomes the problem. So conflict is inevitable, unavoidable. We experience it in our heads. We have inner conflict. Oh, do we do this or do we do that? Do we make this decision? Do we make that decision? We all experience it every day. Put two people in a room, they will find themselves in conflict. Differences of needs, different values, different beliefs. It's not the conflict. The conflict itself is neutral. It's how we choose. And I emphasize the word choose here, Jennifer, because it's really very important. It's how we choose to act. Those actions, interactions, and reactions, whether we choose for them to become constructive and functional and actually bring us together, or do we choose for them to become destructive and dysfunctional? And unfortunately, within our brains, there's the part of our brain, the chimp. I'm sure people will be familiar with the chimp paradox or the amygdala. It takes us over. It takes over. It hijacks us, and so it tricks us into behaving badly. So it's not that we can't go blaming people or pointing a finger at people for behaving badly in conflict, of course, so long as they haven't harmed another. What we need to be able to do is create the systems and the processes to help them to make better choices about how they resolve it through in the future, to become more rational, to think more clearly. And that's, again, the power of mediation and the power of dialogue.
So where does conflict truly come from? I mean, is it that monkey brain? Is it just part of the human experience, or are there other causes?
I think it is I think it is a large part of our brains. I mean, when I'm working with HR professionals and leaders, I think it's really helpful for them to understand how the human mind works and how conflict can manifest itself. So all conflicts that I've ever worked with, from a two-party quarrel in an office through to an entire boardroom in loggerheads and in a complete meltdown, comes from loss. And it's about how we react to loss. And there are three forms of loss that are worth bearing in mind. There's an actual loss. I've actually lost something, and we experience a profound sense of grief as a result of that loss. We perceive we might have lost something, and this is very powerful. We perceive we've maybe lost control, we've lost face, we've lost hope, we've lost connection, we've lost a relationship. So it's a perception. It's not a physical, substantive loss, but we perceive it. And the third and the most powerful form of loss, and the one, Jennifer, that I think creates the most damaging and destructive conflicts, is fear of future loss. We all know loss hurts, that when my needs aren't met, I feel hurt, I feel ashamed, I feel sad and lonely. So we'll fight to protect ourselves as human beings from experiencing those losses. So what we need to be able to do, and I think this is really important, is turn the loss to a gain. So we need to start asking questions of people. What is it you feel you're losing? Why do you feel you're losing it? What do you need in order to be able to turn that loss into a gain? So I think all conflict stems from loss in one form or another, and I've highlighted the three. So, and I think that is part of the human condition. And when we handle it well, it's the most profoundly powerful and experience that people can have. But conversely, when it's not managed well, the stress, the trauma, the grief, the division, goodness me, we've seen it here in the UK, you've seen it in the US, the damaging impact that it can have when it's not resolved or it's suppressed. And we don't let this stuff come to the surface, and that suppression creates this heat and this power underneath the surface that explodes like a volcano. And that can then become really damaging. Of course, then we need our firefighters, also known as the company's HR team, to come in and start putting those fires out. And I think that's a real shame and a real opportunity missed.
All of that is brilliant insight. I'm just kind of taking it all in here. We're going to take a quick sponsorship break, but when we return, we'll explore the specific social, psychological, and yes, financial costs of conflict. So stay with us.
Thanks to the Respectful Workplace for supporting this week's episode of Project HR. Brand new for 2020, the Respectful Workplace is online harassment prevention that connects with your workforce so you can focus on growth and success. Download our free state-by-state guide to harassment prevention at therespectfulworkplace.net and get started today.
And we're back with David Liddle, CEO of the TCM Group and author of the book Managing Conflict, A Practical Guide to Resolution in the Workplace. So before we tap into the financial cost of conflict, let's talk about its social and psychological impacts, the impact that conflict can have on the people involved in these behaviors. And you mentioned sort of holding back and what that does, as well as the people around them.
Goodness me. I mean, I've seen some really significant effect on people. And we could start with their mental health. I've talked to people who've expressed to me, and this is hard to hear. I'm going to talk about people who've expressed suicidal thoughts. I've had people describing those to me. I've had people talking to me who can't sleep at night, who've experienced a breakdown in their relationships at home. One lady described to me of walking into work with bricks in her belly. How can you be a productive, engaged, active, purposeful member of a team when we're walking around with bricks in our belly? So one of the costs, and in some respects, the hidden cost, and probably the cost that I really urge organizational leaders, HR and people professionals to focus on, is the human cost. Because, of course, that has a significant impact on our ability to be productive, to be engaged, to feel like an included member of the team where my contribution is achieving the purpose. So if we look at the stakeholder value measure of the firm, think about shareholder value and stakeholder value. If an employee is experiencing a dysfunctional and destructive conflict with a colleague or a manager, they're not able to give their best, they're not happy or healthy or able to perform to the high standards, then it has a significant impact on the achievement of that organization measured in terms of stakeholder value and shareholder value. Now, I would say to an organizational leader, therefore, conflict should be your number one strategic priority. Because when we handle it well, it unlocks innovation. It's powerful. It unlocks dialogue, connectivity, innovation, support, collaboration, connectedness, a commitment to purpose. But when we don't handle it well, then it actually has almost a diametrically opposite impact. Sadly, I could say, certainly here in the UK and elsewhere, I go into boardrooms and I go into HR teams and leadership teams and I ask them, is this a strategic priority? And what I see is they have better strategies for ordering paper clips than they do for handling this stuff, Jennifer. And it's sad because it misses the opportunity to address this stuff, not just at a strategic level, but across the organization. So I don't know if I've answered. I don't know if I've answered your question, there, Jennifer, but
You have.
It's the human cost, and if we,
Yes,
because we could talk about the final, the figures that you've shared there are eye-watering. 359 billion. It's an incredible. It's almost an impossible amount to understand. But if I understand that my partner, my friend, my parent, my sister, my brother, my cousin, my uncle is having a tough time in their organization because of a conflict, and they feel sad and they don't feel motivated and they want to leave their job and they feel trapped, I can understand that. I can connect with that, and that makes sense to me as another human being. So maybe trying to answer the question succinctly, and I'm doing a very bad job of it, Jennifer, but trying to answer it succinctly for you, what I would say is we need to understand the human impact of conflict to really begin to resolve it effectively.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. So we just talked about that $359 billion annual cost, and that's in the United States. But how does conflict add up to so much loss?
Wow, I mean, it's quite. So if you take a balanced scorecard, again, I'm sure many people listening to the podcast will understand balanced scorecard or using aggregate scores. We can build a balanced scorecard around conflict. In fact, I've designed one. It's in my book, and what the balanced scorecard or that calculator does is we start to look at the various costs. Let's take absence. Let's take recruitment. Let's take suspensions. Let's take investigations. Let's take drop in morale and productivity. Let's take impact on the team's effectiveness. Let's look at management capability, management time spent resolving these issues. Let's now start to introduce litigation. Let's start looking at legal fees and other costs associated with litigation. And suddenly those hundreds of pounds turn into thousands of pounds, turn into tens of thousands of pounds, hundreds of thousands, or in some cases, of course, if we're thinking in dollars, into millions of dollars. And also, let's look at the reputational impact on our brand and our organizations. The press and the media and the social media are electrified by disputes in companies, in organizations. And we just have to look at our own royal family and the situation there. But every single day, I can go onto social media, I can go onto the various news channels, and I'm going to read about another company who's experienced a spat, a disagreement, or dispute, and those leaders in those organizations have spent hundreds, millions of dollars building that reputation, protecting that brand. They have entire departments there to protect their brand. Yet one unresolved dispute that reaches the news or social media can, in a blaze of a storm, and it feels like a storm, in a storm, can drag that company down. And that can be measured very clearly in reputation. So that's, I think, how we can start to look at that figure. And I would imagine when we start to look at all of that, it's probably an underestimate.
That's probably true. Now, David, we're used to thinking of conflict really as a negative. Can conflict ever be seen as a positive, as constructive?
Absolutely. I think conflict, let's take that as a difference of opinion and different needs, goals, and hopes and motivations. It's a profound opportunity for us to come together and share ideas. When it's managed well, as I mentioned earlier, when it's managed well, it can become a very constructive and functional part of the organization. Now, I would argue that actually, when it's managed well, not only can a manager, a leader, or an HR professional resolve the underlying issues in the dispute, thereby reducing the cost of the dispute going forward. And this is where I think it becomes really interesting. In that conversation between our two parties who are at loggerheads, who are opposed to each other in confrontation, they begin to turn their energy away from each other and towards each other. And as they begin to turn their energies towards each other, they start to ask each other some questions. They become curious. They become interested. Why did that happen? How did that happen? Do you understand the impact of that situation? What was the root cause of that? Now, what happens is oftentimes the root cause of a conflict isn't just the relationship. It's a system in the organization that's failing. It's a process in the organization which is inefficient. It's a structure in the organization which is causing division or some kind of a challenge between the individuals. And so those two parties who are experiencing the systems, the structures, and the processes, actually through the conflict can begin to highlight what those failings are, and for the manager, begin to highlight potential practical solutions. Now, you could have an army of management consultants talking about agile this and lean that and process this and reorganizing that. But if we get two parties in a dispute in the room, they will tell you within a very short space of time with absolute clarity and certainty where the failings are. Now, as a manager who's about driving profitability, productivity, increasing performance, aligning my team's objectives to the purpose and the strategy of the firm, surely if I harness that knowledge and that insight from the parties in conflict, it will help me to achieve my objectives as a manager. So I speak to managers. This isn't just about being morally and ethically nice. Let's be honest, Jennifer, it is a bit about that because that's important.
Right, sure.
But it's also about helping managers to manage and lead their organizations by supporting and helping those people in conflict to help them to manage their teams going forward. So for me, mediation becomes not just a win-win between our two parties, but it becomes a win-win-win, because suddenly our manager is gaining management knowledge, data, and intelligence to help them go forward. So absolutely, it can be constructive. And when it's managed well, wow.
Yeah. So let's talk about your experience a little bit. How have you seen companies handle conflict in the past? Like what worked, what didn't work in these traditional methods?
Yeah. So, I have to be very careful what I say here, Jennifer, but the word
Sure.
woefully, and if I put it diplomatically as a mediator, woefully and inadequate might be two of my more diplomatic and podcast-friendly phrases that I would use. I think we've become very scared of conflict in our organizations. We see it as a threat. We see it as a risk. And as a result of that, we wrap ourselves up in risk mitigation, in complexity and bureaucracy to try and manage the risk. Paradoxically, the more we wrap ourselves up in complexity and bureaucracy, the more damaging, the more corrosive, the more polarized, and the more dogmatic the disputes become. So one of the great things I see within HR teams and within the people function and within leadership functions is when the leadership function realizes and recognizes actually by applying less pressure on policy, process, and procedure and putting greater emphasis on people, then actually those organizations can secure better outcomes. So to me, there's a resolution revolution happening in our organizations. And the revolution is a recognition that policy, process, and procedure, whilst important, should operate in the background. In the foreground, we should be focused on our people, our values, and our culture. And the HR, the people and culture profession, the people function, the leadership function, our managers, our union reps, should all be committed to bringing those individuals around the table and not tying them up and suppressing them through these risk mitigation systems, which I'm afraid to report. And I think anyone who cares to pick up their grievance cases or disputes from the last 12 months would probably find the same outcome. It doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. David, we're going to take some time out for another quick break, and we'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and our guest today is David Liddle, CEO of the TCM Group and author of the book Managing Conflict, A Practical Guide to Resolution in the Workplace. And we're back. So I came across a quote of yours that I felt spoke to the history of trying to mitigate crisis quite well. You said regarding conflict management, there's a cultural problem in our workplaces of extensive inaction or expensive overreactions. So how can we address that problem?
I think in some respects, it does provide a nice polarization of dispute. At one end, we have complete avoidance, sticking our head in the sand, sweeping it under the carpet, ignoring it. And of course, many people who are in conflict will recognize that. And our managers feel unconfident or unable to resolve the issue. At the other end of the spectrum is overreaction, the costs which we've talked about, the complexity. But in the middle of that is action. Now, let me describe the action to you, and it doesn't need an awful lot. Listening not to defend, not to blame or to find culpability, but listening for meaning, listening to really hear what people are saying. And do you know what people often say to me after a mediation case? I've been doing it for 30 years, and it still staggers me, Jennifer, when I hear this, is, David, thank you for listening to me. And I say to them, but this has been going on for 12 months. Now, I can't be the first person that's listened to you. I've just happened to have been shipped in as a mediator, And they say to me, they look me in the eyes and they say, David, you're the first person who's listened to me and not sought to judge me or trip me up or find fault. And I think to myself, what a sad situation we have when we have someone who's been in such a long-term dispute without having been heard. So the first action is listen. Listen for meaning, not listening to defend. The second one, and it's very simple, it's not complicated. Try and imagine what's going on for them in their lives. Don't make assumptions about them. They're not the bad person. They're not the problem. The problem is the problem. Try and put yourself in their shoes and be empathetic and try and get under the surface of what's really going on for them. Now, that's not to say you're going to agree or disagree with them. It's not about who's right or who's wrong, but it's trying to imagine what might be going on in their lives for them at that moment in time. And that creates an incredibly powerful connection. And of course, if we look at emotional intelligence, which I'm talking about here, that also allows me to become a little bit more reflective and a little bit more open. I've got loads of them, but I've got one more I think is important, and it's really I've spend hours talking about these because action is about action. But the final action is people may be familiar with the saying, you can't shake hands with a clenched fist. Of course, that was Gandhi who said that. But I would say you can't shake hands with a clenched fist. You can't speak with a clenched jaw. You can't listen with a clenched mind. So we need to unclench these things which are happening because of stress. They're happening because we're wound up. So relax. But relax. Take it seriously, but don't let it become a stressor for you. And unclench. And actually, as we do so, we find we move from a defensive response to a more of an engagement and an empowerment response. And as we do so, it creates this powerful dialogue between the parties. So action, listen, action, be empathetic, and action, reach out and empower yourself and the other person.
Let's talk about your book a little bit, Managing Conflict. You mentioned in the last bit about how you have loads of ways of handling conflict. Can you talk about those approaches a little bit and what's in your book?
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for mentioning it. So I think the first thing I would say within the text is I'm advocating for a new policy framework what I call the GBH policies, the grievance, bullying and harassment policies, they've run out of steam, Jennifer. They don't play any reasonable or useful part in a modern, progressive, diverse organisation. We're all coping with the challenges of discrimination, of exclusion, of bias, of racism, of misogyny, and of systems and processes in our society and within our organisations which undermine and damage relationships. We cannot resolve the issues. We cannot build back better. We cannot resolve the issues that we're all facing in our society and our organisations by relying on these retributive, destructive, divisive systems that have unfortunately failed us in the past. So the first thing I'm advocating in my text and also in the next text, which I know we will talk about, is for HR leaders, unions and others to be brave and to be courageous and recognise that moving from a retributive model of justice to a more restorative model of justice, which is about courage and dialogue and empathy and engagement, is the most powerful way of holding people to account. So the first thing I would be saying, and have said and do say and will continue to say, is let's reframe what we mean by justice in our organisations. And what I say in my text is you can secure a just and fair outcome, not by investigating and shaming and punishing another person, but you can secure a just and fair and inclusive, a sustainable outcome through dialogue, through listening, and through full and open engagement. And that then sets, if we think about the organisation's policy framework being adapted to more of a focus on resolution, it opens up amazing opportunities for our people colleagues, our HR colleagues, coaching, mentoring, and more of an enabling function. I talk about the development of multidisciplinary hubs within our organisations, where people can come together and become predictive and proactive. This stuff is predictable. People are going to fall out. So we can start to work together to anticipate where problems might occur. And the HR function, rather than being custodians of the policy process and procedure, actually become the ambassadors of people, value and culture. And of course, for our line managers, those people who are dealing with this every day, we need to empower them. We can't just say, you're a bad manager because you didn't handle this very well. And actually they turn around and say, well, I've never been on a training course. It wasn't in my job description. No one told me I had to do it. That's not going to be adequate when we're dealing with these complex issues. So we need to support our managers. We need to give them the skills, the training, the coaching, the guidance that they need to be able to have these conversations in their departments, their depots, their clinics, their wards, wherever they're working. And we also need, I think, Jenna, to change our attitude to failure. We see conflict every day in the media, but we also see responses to failure, which I often feel are undermining the ability for people to gain insight, learning, and growth. Things will go wrong. Things do go wrong. But what we need to be able to do is give people the opportunity to have the courage to go into conversations and for them to be challenging conversations and for them not to suddenly be dismissed or suspended because that conversation wasn't effective. So we need to think about how we handle failure in our organisations and support managers. And finally, I'm going to focus on the role of the leader. We can't have our leaders sat in boardrooms chanting one rule for them and another rule for us. That's not going to work.
Right.
We need our leaders to align their behaviours, their moral compass, their ethics and their approaches to the needs and purpose of the organisation and the stated values of the organisation. So we need our leaders to walk the talk. And we need our leaders to show compassion. We need them to show a commitment to dialogue and to take this stuff seriously. Because if they don't take it seriously at the top of our organisations, then how can we possibly expect anyone else to take this seriously through our organisation?
For sure. I do want to talk a little bit about the need for courage. Like, what is the role? We talk a lot about the courage of a leader. What is the role of a leader's courage in managing conflict?
Well, it's really important question because I think we sometimes forget that leaders and managers are human beings. It's not about pointing the finger; it's recognizing this is challenging. And when you watch stuff happening and playing out in front of you, and strong emotions and people feeling excluded and discriminated against, this is career-defining stuff. In fact, as I've already alluded to, it's organizational defining stuff. And here I am saying, run towards it, don't run away from it. Well, if you're asking people to run towards the fire, Jennifer, you've got to give them the equipment they need to do it. Because
Sure.
I think it does take a strength of heart. It takes real character and real courage. And I recognize that, and I celebrate it and value it and applaud it. And whenever I see it happen, I wish they won more awards for it. I just wish dialogue and these approaches were what made our organizations great, because for me, it is what makes our organizations great. So I'd be telling more stories, and I love the power of a story in our organizations. Telling more stories about where leaders and managers have demonstrated the courage, aligning that courage to the positive impact that it's achieved, and giving people the skills and the kit, the tools that they need. If the only tool that our manager has in their toolkit is a hammer, every problem is a nail.
Yep, for
And
sure.
our employees aren't nails, Jennifer. They're people. They're human beings.
Right.
They might need something different on a Tuesday than they did on a Wednesday. I need my manager to be flexible, adaptable, and able to respond to my needs. How do they do it? By listening to me and understanding my needs. So we need to give them the skills to do that. But courage is at the heart of this. But that courage builds connections.
Sure.
And it's the connections that can help our organizations to really become high achieving and high performing.
David, I've enjoyed talking with you so much. This is such an important topic, and talking about all of this with you has been so informative. I think we've decided to turn this episode into our very first 2-part episode.
Wow. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm really flattered. I'm glad that it's been enjoyable. I've really enjoyed the conversation as well. So, I look forward to hearing it.
All right. So I want to let our listeners know that they can stay tuned for the second part of this episode next week.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks very much again for inviting me.
You're so welcome. And as always, we'd like to thank our listeners as well. Once again, this is your reminder to grab the companion guide for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. And if you'd like to be on Project HR, or you know someone who would, feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. On Twitter and Facebook, you can find us at Projections, and on LinkedIn at Projections Inc. And last, but certainly not least, to make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or simply rate us 5 stars wherever you get your content. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.